Okay, here we'll now have another look at the menstrual cycle, and in the next two slides I'm going to focus less on the hormones and more on the actual events that happen inside the uterus and inside the ovary. The two ovaries are here on the side. I'm just going to label this one here. It's the ovary, and the uterus, of course, over here. So what I have over here is a picture of the events taking place, and down here another image which is a little bit more complete, because over here we're missing something, and I have to admit I don't know why whoever put this online, I think it was from Wikipedia, did not include this important information here. So for this reason I included the picture down here as well. So what happens during the menstrual cycle? And essentially there are two places that are influenced by the hormones. The one is the ovary, of course. So something is going on inside the ovary. This is basically illustrated up here and also down here, and something is going on inside the uterus, and that is illustrated in the drawing down here. So first of all, at the start of the menstrual cycle, you have an event called the menses, and that is the menstrual bleeding. And here the endometrium, which is the inside lining of the uterus, is lost over bleeding. And during this stage inside the ovary, also a follicle starts to mature. So this happens at the same time. Bleeding happens, and slowly one of the follicles starts to mature. It starts to grow in size, and inside the follicle over here you have an ovum, which is the same as the egg cell. And it starts to mature and grow. And down here it's also illustrated. You can see that the follicles at the beginning are very small. They start to grow in size. And you can see over here also the egg cell, the ovum. And bleeding stops, the egg cell continues to ripen, and slowly the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus, starts to regenerate and build up. And you can see it over here in pink, that over here the uterus has now regenerated. And this is now approximately 14 days after the start of menstruation. And this is when ovulation takes place. And ovulation is the release of the egg cell from the follicle. And you also have it down here. So the egg cell, so that's basically also the egg cell. And you can see that the follicle pops open and the egg cell is released. And if you want to see it over here, inside the ovary over here you have the follicle. Inside the follicle you have the egg, and the follicle pops open and the egg is released and passed on down the fallopian tubes to the uterus. So this here, that's basically happening over here. So 14 days after the start of menstruation, approximately 14 days afterwards, you have ovulation happening. And then the empty follicle now becomes the so-called corpus luteum, or yellow body. And this is now the drawing which is kind of missing over here. So I'm just going to draw it a little bit like that. Okay, that is supposed to be my empty follicle, the corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum now produces the next hormone called progesterone. And down here it's referred to as secretory, and it refers to the secretion of progesterone. So the empty follicle is still good for something, namely it makes a hormone. And then it starts to slowly degenerate over the next several days, and it stops producing progesterone. So I'm just going to draw the follicle a little bit smaller over here to illustrate that essentially it's starting to degenerate, and it produces less progesterone, and therefore the endometrium lining cannot be maintained anymore, and the next menstrual bleeding starts. So that is basically an overview over the events that happen inside the ovary and the uterus. However, I also have on the next foil a slightly more detailed drawing, which also places an emphasis on the involved hormones. I have to change my pen color now to white. I will do that. Okay, here we are. Now I've changed it to white, and I'm going to explain this one over here. Essentially, it's exactly the same thing as the one that you over here and the one on the previous foil. You have here a whole bunch of small immature follicles. One of them starts to grow. It becomes the follicle that actually then has the finished egg cell. Over here, this is ovulation. The egg cell, the ovum, is released into the fallopian tubes and travels down the fallopian tubes to the uterus. And this is the empty follicle. The empty follicle is the corpus luteum, which produces the hormone progesterone in order to maintain the uterus lining. So essentially, not a lot of new information over here, but you can now see it in more detail what the relationship between the follicle and the corpus luteum and the whole ovary is. So this oval circle down here is of course not a circle, but that is the ovary. So, and over here now, let's have a look at some of these lines over here. And the for hormones, FSH, estradiol, that is estrogen, same thing, luteinizing hormone and progesterone. And over here, what happens in the ovary, over here, what happens in the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus. And that is basically seen over a little bit over here. That is the endometrium. And I'm going to explain these hormone levels now, and I'm also going to make a correction here because there is something which is not quite correct here either. So the cycle starts with the first day of menstruation, of menses, of bleeding, and that's why we have over here day 1. And this basically should represent the bleeding, and here they indicated it takes about a week, yeah, more or less. And the thickness of the endometrium therefore decreases because because of the bleeding. And during this time, the pituitary gland in the brain starts to produce FSH. And now you kind of wonder, well, if it produces, why did it stay low? Well, because they didn't draw it properly. You should actually have an increase in FSH over here. Again, I think this is a very bad and incomplete drawing, but, well, that's why I have a pen to correct this. So, follicle stimulating hormone is first produced by the pituitary gland in the brain. This causes the maturing of the follicle and the formation of an egg cell, the ripening of an egg cell. This FSH also tells the follicle to produce estrogen, and estradiol over here, that is the same as estrogen. And so you can see that over here the level of estrogen then also increases, and what this estrogen does is it repairs and regenerates the lining of the uterus. So you can see that the endometrium becomes thicker again. So here everything was quite thin because everything was lost over the menstrual bleeding, and now with the estrogen it's starting to increase in thickness as well. And again, the follicle itself is responsible for making this estrogen. When the estrogen has reached a certain level, it tells the pituitary gland again to produce the next hormone, which is called LH, or luteinizing hormone. And this is a very sharp peak at around day 14. You can see over here that's around the middle of the cycle, day 14, day 15, you have an LH peak. Now you can also see that there is a small FSH peak. Yes, but I would actually consider this one over here more important here at the beginning. Of course, there are always changes in hormones, also probably around here, but this peak here at the beginning I consider more important. The LH peak is relatively easy to identify because it's low, and then there's a sharp peak which lasts a few days only, and then it goes down. And if you're able to identify this peak, then you also know when menstruation started, which was probably around 14 days before. And this LH causes ovulation. It causes the formation of the corpus luteum. Luteinizing hormone means that it causes the formation of the corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum now starts to produce the hormone progesterone, which is produced by the corpus luteum, which is found inside the ovary, of course. So the ovary therefore produces progesterone, and this progesterone level goes up here, as you can see, and it maintains and supports the uterus lining. So it's relatively thick here. And as the corpus luteum degenerates, the level of progesterone later on drops again, and when it has dropped beneath a certain critical level, then the next menstrual bleeding is going to start, and we're back here at the beginning of the next cycle. And the whole process takes approximately 28 days, plus minus. So that was basically now an overview which tried to link the hormones with the events in the endometrium and inside the follicle. If you have problems remembering this, then remember that FSH and the LH, those which are abbreviated, are formed by the pituitary gland, and therefore, if they're formed in the brain, in the pituitary, then they have to act on something else, namely the ovaries. And those with the long names, estrogen, estradiol, and progesterone, they are produced by the ovary. And F for FELP, FSH, estrogen, LH, and progesterone. That is the sequence of hormones, FELP. That's a little bit easier to remember. Okay, so this was basically it. If you have still problems understanding all of these interactions and everything, then I simply recommend that you grab yourself, look for, online for a few of these diagrams and try to identify which hormone is what. And that is, as a matter of fact, I think a pretty good practice. Okay, that was it.